In 1928, at a time when few Americans went to college, Reagan attended Eureka College, run by the Disciples of Christ. He majored in sociology and economics. "I got poor marks," Reagan later admitted, "but I copped off the lead in most plays, and in football, I won 3 varsity sweaters." Reagan graduated from Eureka in 1932. It was the depths of the Great Depression, but it took Reagan only 6 weeks to find a job at WOC Radio. Later, he moved to Des Moines to work as a sportscaster. Life was easy for Ronald Reagan. He had money, independence, and the time to learn to ride. For the next 4 summers, using only statistics coming through telegraph, Reagan transported his listeners to the bleachers of Wrigley Field with his vivid recreations of baseball games he never saw.
If you look at where Reagan is really a master communicator, it really is on radio. If you think about Reagan's career as an actor and as a president and as a speaker, just generally, he was a powerful recreator. He recreated our experiences.
I remember Hugh Sidey telling me that when he was a child in Iowa in the 30s, in the Dust Bowl years, he used to hear Ronald Reagan's voice coming over the airwaves. And he said, just doing baseball commentary, but he said, there was something about that voice that gave me as a child the feeling that life was going to get better.
Reagan had long dreamed of becoming an actor, and in 1937, he went to Hollywood. He recalled the moment he stepped onto the set of his first film, Love Is on the Air. "I was surrounded by a wall of light which gave me a feeling of privacy that completely dispelled any nervousness I might have expected."
Reagan has always liked to be looked after. He likes to have a Jack Warner in charge of the finances. He likes to have a wardrobe mistress and a supporting cast. He likes to be surrounded by the busyness of a great commercial enterprise. And that's where I think Ronald Reagan became a corporate person.
Ronald Reagan would make more than 50 films. Only in one did he play the villain.
Reagan loved the hero's role because he fantasized himself as a heroic figure. The first time his mother sees him in the first film he plays in, she looks at the screen and she says, "That's my Dutch." And what she's speaking to is the idea that he's himself on the screen, that he's, in a sense, playing out the fantasy that he has, that he's very comfortable with.
Reagan was becoming a box office draw. Guaranteed work and steady pay, he brought Nell and Jack to California and bought them the only home they ever owned. In 1940, he married a promising young actress, Jane Wyman. Ron and Jane became the darlings of the Warner Brothers publicity machine, a valuable asset for an industry preoccupied with its image.
They were always worried, the people who ran the studios, that some whiff of scandal involving their bright stars would cause people to stop turning out en masse at the box office, or that the Legion of Decency would turn on them, and something like that. Reagan and Wyman were real, you know. They were in love. They were wholesome. People liked to look at them, and if you wanted to celebrate the marriage, Reagan was willing. So they did.
With their daughter Maureen and their adopted son Michael, the Reagans were promoted as the perfect Hollywood family.
Ronald Reagan came up from middle America. He came up in the movies in a time where most of the movies were designed to make people feel good when they left rather than to feel sad. He reflected these kinds of qualities.
Reagan was cast as football legend George Gipp in Newt Rockne All-American. It was his first major film, the one that earned him the nickname the Gipper.
Try it anyway.
All right, if you insist.
Now, wait a minute. What's your name?
Gipp. George Gipp. What's yours?
Is he kidding me?
Hello, handsome.
Oh, hi, Chip.
My, you're a dream tonight.
How's the party?
I don't know. She hasn't come out yet.
Who are you waiting for?
Oh, a friend of mine promised me a surprise tonight. A night I'd remember the rest of my life.
In 1940, he played opposite screen giant Errol Flynn in Santa Fe Trail.
As high as you think you do, Captain Stewart.
But the height of his acting career was as Drake McHugh in King's Row.
Randy! Where's the rest of me? Randy!
Yes, Drake?
It was that accident.
Yes, dear.
By the time King's Row opened, America was at war, and so was Ronald Reagan. But only on the screen. Reagan spent the war making training films at Culver City, less than 10 miles from home.
He certainly learned and loved to wear a uniform, to act like a soldier, to salute properly. There's nothing he enjoyed more as president than saluting. As commander-in-chief, he would do that little extra flip to the salute, which you hardly ever see in the armed services anyway. It was a real Hollywood salute, but it meant a great deal to him.
Hollywood emerged from World War II with a new understanding of the power of movies in shaping American views. Many who had mobilized in support of the war now turned their attention to other causes. I blindly joined every organization, Reagan wrote, that would guarantee to save the world. As a liberal Democrat, he spoke on issues ranging from the dangers of atomic weapons to racial equality. If he knew some of his associates were communists, he did not seem to care.
He's involved in these, leftist organizations where the communists clearly were struggling for control. The communists valued Hollywood. Reagan was one of these people who had dismissed this, who had dismissed the communist conspiracy, the communist threat, and then when he became convinced that it was real, he over-dramatized it and overreacted to it.
There had long been communists in Hollywood, writers and directors quietly exercising their influence in relative freedom. But as the United States and the Soviet Union slid into the Cold War, they were eyed with growing suspicion. Reagan confronted communist activism in 1946, when, as a member of the Screen Actors Guild board, he was asked to mediate a dispute between rival unions. One was led by a rumored communist, Herb Sorrell. Sorrell's union went on strike. The leadership does not want a settlement, Reagan concluded. It stands to gain by continued disorder and disruption.
Reagan liked order, stability, and security. And the fact that they were involved in physical violence at the studio gates, which he personally experienced, buses being overturned, windows smashed, stones thrown, bottles brandished, some bloodshed. The fact that he personally witnessed this, personally experienced it, associated it with red, as he would have said, red domination of the Union, That's what turned him.
Sorel and Reagan went head to head. When Reagan crossed the picket line outside Warner Brothers, Sorel called for a boycott of his movies. Reagan was called a fascist. An anonymous phone caller threatened to disfigure his face so he could never act again. He began carrying a gun. Now I knew from first-hand experience how communists used lies, deceit, and violence to advance the cause of Soviet expansionism, Reagan later recalled.
He's the heroic figure battling against communism. It's not simply that he's fighting against communism, but that he's rescuing the Screen Actors Guild. He's rescuing Hollywood. He's helping to rescue the country from the communist menace.
His effort was to deny them any real foothold in our guild, for example. I recall at one membership meeting, as he addressed the audience, he said, you know, of course, that we have some communists here. And he pointed. They're going to try to make 11 or 12 people sound like hundreds. And he fought all the way, very hard and very diligently, and I think successfully.
Reagan became an informant for the FBI. And in 1947, as president of the Screen Actors Guild, he testified as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
I will be frank with you that as a citizen, I would hesitate, or I would not like to see any political party outlawed on the basis of its political ideology, because we've spent 170 years in this country on the basis that democracy is strong enough to stand up and fight for itself against the inroads of any ideology, no matter how much we may disagree with it. However, if it is proven that this organization is the agent of a foreign power or is in any way not a legitimate political party, and I think the government is capable of doing that if the proof is there, then that is another matter.
10 writers and directors were sentenced to prison, not for being communists, but for refusing to cooperate with the committee. They and many others were included in a blacklist and denied work.
Reagan went along with the blacklist. Now, I don't think he descended the moral depths or anything. He did what most people did, and he did it somewhat more reluctantly and somewhat more slowly than most of them. But the fact is that the blacklist is a blemish.
Reagan had discovered his first political passion, anti-communism. He paid a high price for his obsession.
Reagan came home and was told, this is over, the marriage is over, and that he was totally stunned by it, that it was like he was, hit by a ton of bricks, and it was a very, very hard thing for him to accept or get over.
Perhaps I should have let someone else save the world, he later wrote, and saved my own home.
Reagan was in deep depression. He lost his wife. He breaks his leg in an amateur baseball game and is hospitalized for most of 1949. And by the time he'd hobbled out of the hospital on crutches, he was a changed man. And I remember him saying once over dinner, telling the story of that awful year, and then along came Nancy Davis and saved my soul.
When Ronald Reagan met Nancy Davis, she was a young actress under contract at MGM. Wealthy and socially well-connected, she shared with Ronald the experience of an insecure childhood. Abandoned by her father, Nancy was left in the care of an aunt, while her mother, actress Edith Luckett, toured the country. Nancy was 8 when Edith married a prominent Chicago neurosurgeon, Loyal Davis. Almost overnight, she entered a world of privilege. In 1949, when she was mistakenly included on a list of Hollywood communists, Nancy sought Ronald Reagan's help to clear her name. They were married in a private ceremony in 1952. 7 months later, Patty was born.
My parents have about as close a relationship as I've ever seen anyone have. They really sort of complete each other. They're kind of two halves of a circle.
He's a guy who's almost impossible to dislike, who always thinks the best of people, can't believe that anybody who's, ever met him would ever want to do anything bad to him, would ever want to go behind his back, would ever want to stab him in the back. That's just not within his realm of thinking. He just can't conceive of it. Nancy, on the other hand, is far more cunning about that sort of stuff. She has no trouble understanding stabbing in the back.
Ladies and gentlemen, we take pride in presenting a thoughtful address by Ronald Reagan. Mr. Reagan.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Reagan burst onto the national political scene in 1964 with a televised address on behalf of conservative Republican candidate Barry Goldwater.
I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course.
President Lyndon Johnson had just declared his war on poverty, expanding the role of government.
The speech, as it's known amongst Reaganauts, that was the culmination of, the quintessence of all his speeches honed on the GE circuit.
This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are told...
Time magazine called the speech the one bright spot in a dismal campaign. Although it could not rescue Goldwater from defeat, it placed Reagan on the cutting edge of conservative politics.
I've come to a decision that even a short time ago I would have thought impossible for me to make. And yet I make it with no lingering doubts or hesitation. As of now, I am a candidate seeking the Republican nomination for governor.
California in the 1960s is a society that is going through tumultuous change. He runs in 1966 as a staunch Goldwater conservative who will restore to the people their autonomy and freedom from government. And it strikes resonant chords with millions of people in California who were bothered by the welfare system, bothered by the high taxes, bothered by the radicalism of the students, bothered by the crime in the streets, bothered by the inner city explosions. And on all those counts, he was very effective in appealing to the mass of suburban voters in California.
Democratic Governor Pat Brown underestimated Reagan and the revolt brewing in his state.
What have my opponents' contributions been to this growing, thriving state of ours? He's divided his time between propaganda pitches against everything from Medicare to the Tennessee Valley Authority, and starring in such unforgettable screen epics as Bedtime for Bunzo.
On January 2nd, 1967, Ronald Reagan took the oath of office as governor of the state of California. He had not only beaten Brown, he had beaten him by 1 million votes.
That you take this obligation freely, without mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that you will well and faithfully discharge...
I was hysterical when I found out that my father had been elected governor. The Vietnam War was going on. Berkeley was going on. The one place I wanted to be, if I hadn't been 14 years old and at a boarding school in Arizona, was on the streets of Haight-Ashbury, braiding flowers into my hair. I mean, this was my goal in life. And now my father was governor of California. So this was I just didn't think it was a good image for me, you know?
We were down at the University of California campus in Santa Barbara, and all of the students were all mad at him we'd come back from lunch to go back to where they were having the meeting, and the students just kind of lined up along the pathway, and they all gave him the silent treatment, you know, and nobody said hello, nobody waved, nobody did anything. They just stood and stared at him. So he walked through this gauntlet of people very nonchalantly. He got up to the doorway of where we were going, turned around, and he said, "Shh." Everybody broke out laughing, and he walked on in.
Reagan struck a chord with Americans nationwide who were becoming fed up with the radical 60s.
I saw him make a speech in 1964 for Goldwater. I said, there's the man that should be running for president, and there's the man that we need for president.
I like the way he takes a firm stand on things and the way he goes about them.
I think his views agree with mine.
He has the same type of feeling with the people that John Kennedy had, I think.
He's the hope of America.
A Reagan draft initiative caught fire. When the Republicans gathered in Miami in 1968, Reagan, after only 18 months in elected office, was the choice for president among conservatives. By then, former Vice President Richard Nixon had a lock on the nomination.
I hereby proudly move on behalf of my fellow Californians that this convention declare itself as unanimously and united behind the candidate Richard Nixon as the next president of the United States, and I so move.
Reagan was not upset. He told me, "Lynn, I just didn't think I was ready for it." So, you know, he knew himself very well, and he'd have taken it if there'd been this great demand for him, but he knew that he would be better off waiting.
Reagan returned to California to face the first true crisis of his governorship. The student revolt, which had begun in 1964, reached its climax at Berkeley in the spring of 1969. The university was paralyzed by a student strike, which was joined by members of the Black Panther Party and even some professors.
There was a spellbinding moment when he was governor, confronting a bunch of Berkeley University profs. Suddenly recognizes in their midst a radical from his Hollywood days. His name was, I think, Popsky. And he said, "You, Popsky, I know you and I know what you stand for." Lost his cool. There's a direct connection there. The anarchy that prevailed on the Berkeley campus in 1969 with the anarchy that he saw immediately after World War II outside the gates of Warner Brothers.
When the police failed to break the strike, Reagan sent in the California Highway Patrol. That only heightened tensions.
I believe that where any group's rights are being imposed upon, or any individual's rights by any others, it is the obligation of government to protect those constitutional rights at the point of bayonet if necessary.
The National Guard descended on Berkeley replete with bayonets. It occupied the city for 17 days. Most Californians regarded Reagan as a hero for restoring the peace at Berkeley. Others felt he had acted as a trigger-happy extremist.
They themselves, at the very
The following year, Reagan ran for re-election, with little to show for his first term. He had promised to lower taxes, but they had increased. And he had failed to curb the growth of government.
The other way around. Some of the things they've said about me in education, this may get you expelled.
Reagan won in November and launched a new initiative to cut back government spending.
Welfare is the biggest single outlay of public funds at 3 different levels of government, federal, state, and county. And welfare is adrift without rudder or compass.
In his first term, Reagan had governed through confrontation. Now he needed to collaborate with the Democratic-controlled Assembly if he wanted his welfare bill to pass.
Reagan was beginning to think about his own legacy. He was beginning to think about the accomplishments that he would be looked back on when he left the governorship. And I'm sure that people would argue that Reagan was also beginning to build or try to build a record to run for president on for a second time.
The bill passed. Reagan saved taxpayers $2 billion and learned an important lesson.
He proved to himself that he could make some changes, that he could not only talk about and move people to get things done, but he could actually move the mechanics of government to get things done. And I think that confidence that it gave Reagan was more important than most people realize.
And so when he left with a kind of a groundswell of approval in the state and a great deal of interest throughout the country among many people that he go on and perhaps run for the presidency in the future.
Reagan retreated to his new ranch in the mountains high above Santa Barbara, Rancho del Cielo, the ranch in the sky.
It was a place where he could renew himself and rejuvenate himself. He would go out, for hours at a time. He'd just sort of disappear up into the hills and into the brush with sometimes with a chainsaw. He was just happy as a clam out there doing his ranch.
You stop and think what this country had been through by 1980. We had been through the Vietnam War. We'd been through Watergate. We'd seen one president after another tarnished by scandal, by failure, by an assassin's bullet. By 1980, we were pretty cynical. By 1980, we had just been through a couple years of double-digit inflation. We'd seen the Soviet Union seemingly on the march around the world, most notably in Afghanistan.
Reagan ran for president on a conservative platform of less government and stronger defense, promising to restore America's greatness.
My fellow citizens of this great nation, with a deep awareness of the responsibility conferred by your trust, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States. They say that the United States has had its day in the sun, that our nation has passed its zenith. They expect you to tell your children that the American people no longer have the will to cope with their problems, that the future will be one of sacrifice and few opportunities. My fellow citizens, I utterly reject that view.
He was so unhappy about what was happening to the country. The fact that people didn't believe in themselves, they didn't believe that they could make things better, that America was a nation in decline, all of those things. And he knew in his heart those things were not true. And he believed that as president, he could make the American people look inside themselves and recreate what they needed to have their own American dream.
I think he felt sincerely in his heart that he was rescuing the United States from a period of poisonous self-doubt, loss of direction, loss of belief in itself. I think he felt in the late 1970s that he could rescue Jimmy Carter's America and carry her back to the shore and make her alive again.
Reagan kicked off his fall campaign in Jersey City with a great American symbol as a backdrop. He addressed a blue-collar ethnic audience, appealing to their patriotism and to their growing sense of insecurity.
Let it show on the record that when the American people cried out for economic help, Jimmy Carter took refuge behind a dictionary. Well, if it's a definition he wants, I'll give him one. A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose yours. And recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his.
Most people don't remember now, but that was probably the worst economic situation the United States had been in since the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Inflation was roaring. Interest rates were going up. People couldn't afford to buy homes. A lot of people remember very clearly, if they were old enough to drive a car then, you couldn't buy gasoline, no matter how much money you had. We had a hostage crisis in Iran. People were getting worried.
52 American diplomats had been held hostage in Iran for a year. They were a daily reminder of America's impotence and a political liability for Jimmy Carter.
I believe that this administration's foreign policy helped create the entire situation that made their kidnap possible. And I think the fact that they've been there that long is a humiliation and a disgrace to this country.
Every day the American hostages remained in captivity, Carter's prospects for re-election dimmed.
Earlier this evening, I spoke on the phone with President Carter. He called, John Anderson called, but the President pledged the utmost in cooperation in the transition that will take place. All I can say to all of you is thank you, and thank you for more than just George Bush and myself. Thank you because if the trend continues, we may very well control one house of the Congress for the first time in a quarter of a century.
The Republicans did gain control of the Senate. Reagan beat Carter in a landslide, carrying 44 states. It was a great victory for Reagan and the conservative movement.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, expectations were low. At a time when America faced an economic crisis and an escalating Cold War, many wondered if anyone could manage the country, least of all a former Hollywood B actor.
You went away and my heart went with you.
Things could go very badly in the first year, Reagan's staff had warned, resulting in an erosion of Republican momentum and public confidence.
If there is some other way to show that we love you, I swear we don't know how.
But Reagan projected great assurance. He believed, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt 50 years before him, that his mission was to restore America's trust in itself.
It is time for us to realize that we're too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams. We're not, as some would have us believe, doomed to an inevitable decline. I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing.
He and Franklin Roosevelt have so much in common. They are both great communicators, they're both buoyant optimists, and they both came to Washington at periods of great economic distress. But there's a major, major difference, apart from one being a liberal, one being a conservative. FDR was a great improviser. He made up the New Deal almost day by day. Reagan came to office with a very fixed set of beliefs and an agenda to try and implement those beliefs.
Ronald Reagan had a few very simple precepts. Government was too big, taxed too much, and the Soviet Union was getting away with murder internationally. You guys work out the details.
If Reagan's presidency failed, his crusade to protect America from big government, begun in 1964, would fail with it. His crusade to save the world from communism, begun in 1946, would fail too.